We were one big happy family on a wagon train headed to Washington, D.C.
The Mule train was headed for the nation's capital, where several thousand persons have set up Resurrection City to demonstrate for jobs and income.
Was just magnificent to see all those folk out there welcoming us to the 1968 Poor People's Campaign, which was held in Resurrection City in Washington, D.C.
Hello and welcome to this special Black History program. My name is Mickey Thompson. I'm the mayor of the city of Douglasville, and I will be your host for today. It's always interesting to bring things to you from a special perspective. Today we're going to do that. With me is a very special guest, and he is going to bring to us some of the events that happened in the city of Douglasville 43 years ago. Let me introduce to you a very special guest today, Reverend Ralph David Abernathy III.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us today, Reverend.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Reverend Abernathy, before we get started with our program today, I wonder if you could just take a few minutes and tell us and our viewers a little bit about yourself.
Well, okay. I am the son of a civil rights leader, Reverend Dr. Ralph David Abernathy, Sr., and my mother, Mrs. Juanita Jones Abernathy. My father was Martin Luther King's best friend, as well as his partner in the civil rights movement. My father pastored the First Baptist Church of Montgomery, Alabama. And when Rosa Parks was arrested, they called my father to organize the community and the ministers around Ms. Parks' arrest, who at that time was the NAACP secretary. Mrs. Parks, the NAACP president, E.D. Nixon, was a Pullman car porter, and he was on his way out of town that night of Mrs. Parks' arrest. So he called a young Turk preacher who was pastoring the First Baptist Church of Montgomery, Alabama, my father, to organize the community as he had to leave to go to work. My father, in turn, went around organizing, calling all of the ministers, and called his newfound friend, who had just gotten to Montgomery, Martin Luther King, Jr. And that was the beginning of their partnership through history. And it lasted until my father and Martin Luther King shared the same room together at the Lorraine Motel. There were double beds in that room. My father was out on the balcony waiting for whom I affectionately call Uncle Martin, and he came out on the balcony, and my father smelled his Aramis cologne. And he said, "Martin, I forgot to put my Aramis on." And Uncle Martin said, "Well, Ralph, I'll be out here on the balcony waiting on you." And when my father went back into the bedroom and the bathroom to put the cologne in his hands, he heard the firecracker shots and immediately thought about Uncle Martin. He then left, and when he was shot, he did not die on the balcony. He died in the hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. No one was allowed to travel with the ambulance but my father and Martin Luther King's assistant, who was Reverend Bernard Lee. Reverend Lee was a short individual, and I think he had a kind of a Napoleonic complex. And he said, "Nobody's getting in the ambulance but Dr. Abernathy." And so my father went to the hospital with Uncle Martin, and he said he committed what they call civil disobedience. He refused to leave the operating room. And at some point in time, the doctors came over and said, "Dr. Abernathy, there's no more we can do for him." And my father went over and cradled him in his arms, and he took his last breaths in my father's arms. From that point forward, my father then became the president of the organization that he and Dr. King founded, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And he completed the work that had been started by he and Uncle Martin. And at that time, they were in the process of developing the Poor People's Campaign. And he finished and completed the Poor People's Campaign and many other marches and demonstrations for equal rights and equality in this country. And so I am the son, and that is my legacy, and that's where my loins come from.
How old was your father at that time?
My father was, I want to say 36 or 37. When he became president of SCLC, I believe he was in his 40s, late 40s, late 40s.
Mm-hmm. And you were just a child then?
Yes, I was just a baby.
Okay.
I was born in Montgomery, Alabama at the age of 3. My mother's home was bombed. The night that they bombed Dr. King's home, the next night they bombed my father and mother's home. My mother was home with my oldest sister, Wandalin, who is an opera singer, and she lives in Europe. She sings with the Munich Opera. And she was pregnant with Donzale, who is an actress that lives in Los Angeles. The bomb was 3 inches from the main gas line. My father and Martin Luther King were here in Atlanta, Georgia, planning and forming the Southern Christian Leadership Conference when the news came that my father's home was bombed, with my mother home and my my oldest sister in the crib. Mm-hmm. They rushed back to Montgomery. 3 years later, I was born. And we moved, when I was 3, we moved from Montgomery to Atlanta, Georgia, at the behest of Martin Luther King, who convinced my father to move to Atlanta. And he found his father, Daddy King Sr., found my father a church and convinced him to move to Atlanta. My father pastored that church for another 30 years. That was the West 100th Street Baptist Church, which is now on Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard.
We have one thing in common. I'm originally from Alabama also.
Oh, really?
And ended up in Atlanta, well, suburb of Atlanta.
What part of Alabama?
Small town, Heflin, Alabama, which is about 55 miles from here.
Well, you're a good
down
man.
I-20.
There are some good people in Alabama.
That's right. I run into people from Alabama all the time. A part of our Georgia Municipal Association, several of those folks are from Alabama, and so it's interesting. You talk to folks, and although we're Georgia residents now, both of us have been for many, many years, we do have our roots in the same place.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
You're good people.
Thank you.
Good people come from Alabama.
That's right. Well, Reverend, thank you for that background information. I wanted to give our viewers a little background information about a very important historical event that actually happened right here in Douglasville. And it's my understanding that 43 years ago, as a young child, 9 years old, you were here in Douglasville. And when you told me this story first, I said, this is something that everyone in our community and everyone in our city and all of our viewers are going to be very interested in. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the event and what you remember, and I realize you're only 9 years old, but what you remember about that event here in Douglasville.
Well, I remember us coming from, we were on what is called a mule train. And many of your viewers may not know what a mule train was, but it was a march where the people who were marching from one city to another would march with mules. Mules, we chose the mules because the mule was the poor man's animal. And we were picking up on the completion of the work that my father and Dr. King had started.
This was after his death.
This was after his assassination and the completion of the Poor People's Campaign. And what the Poor People's Campaign was a journey from, it started in Marks, Mississippi, and it moved all the way, picking up people along the way, all the way from Marks, Mississippi to Washington, D.C. And the route came through Douglasville, Georgia.
Well, before we get into a lot of the details about what you remember, we have a piece that we'd like to show the viewers, which includes a lot of the details about it. This is a piece that was taken from the Titusville, Pennsylvania Saturday morning newspaper, dated June the 15th, 1968.
Police arrested 67 members of a Poor People's Campaign Mule Train Friday and the wagon boss vowed to remain in jail until allowed to continue on the interstate highway where they were taken into custody. State patrolmen halted the Washington-bound caravan after it began moving onto a busy expressway 30 miles west of Atlanta, despite a warning from officers that state law prohibits pedestrians and non-motorized vehicles on a multi-lane road. 67 adults were charged with violating that law, a misdemeanor, and were taken to a National Guard armory where they remained in custody hours later. Also detained were 32 juveniles, 16 or under, who were later released but chose to remain with the adults. Bond was set at $100 for the adults. Among the children were the 9-year-old son of the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and 2 young sons of Hosea Williams, a top SCLC official and campaign leader. The Mule train was headed for the nation's capital, where several thousand persons have set up Resurrection City to demonstrate for jobs and income. Wagon Master Willie Bolden, an SCLC official in charge of the Mule train segment of the Poor People Campaign, spurned offers from Governor Lester Maddox and Douglas County Sheriff Claude Abercrombie, under which those arrested could continue their journey without prosecution. Maddox offered to use state equipment to transfer the 13 rattle-trap wagons, 23 mules, and 3 horses to any point in Georgia, presumably toward the state line. Maddox also offered to waive state law and allow the group to use the highway Interstate 20 between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. when traffic is relatively light. The sheriff volunteered to release everyone if they would take an alternate route into Atlanta. Bolden rejected both offers. "We will continue on Interstate 20, he said.
I remember saying to Governor Lester Maddox and the commander of the Highway State Patrol that I was going to continue on Highway 20. And the reason I said that was because the governor of Mississippi allowed us to use one side of 20 to travel to Washington, D.C. The governor of Alabama, who I believe at that time was Governor Earlene Wallace, allowed us to travel 20 on our way to Washington, D.C. And it was only when we got to Georgia, Douglasville, Georgia, Governor Lester Maddox wanted to stop us from traveling on 20. He offered at that time to load our mules and wagons on some trucks that would be provided by the National Guard, and they were going to put our people in buses and transport us to Atlanta, Georgia. And of course, I refused both of those orders. As a result, they locked me up. They put me in jail. My right-hand man at that time, who was Andrew Mossett, after they locked me up, decided to bring the mules, the wagons, and all of the participants of the mule train down to the city jail in Douglasville. And there they were going to sing freedom songs like they did and vowed to stay there until they turned me loose. It was sometime later, maybe 3 or 4 hours, I guess, the white power structure got together and decided that maybe the best thing to do was to let me out. And when they did, I came out and everybody was jumping up, cheering, here's our wagon master, here's our wagon master. And we had a mass rally in a field. And then I told everyone to come on now, let's get a good night's sleep so we can get ready to get on 20 and come to Atlanta, Georgia. And that's exactly what we did. The next morning, we got up, we made sure and always made sure that our mules were properly fed. We fed them hay, we fed them oats, we brushed them down every night. I had a young man from Mississippi who was an expert at shoeing horses because I knew that the Humane Society was going to be sick on us, and guess what? They did. But they couldn't find anything wrong with those mules. They tried because we made sure that the mules were properly shod, properly fed, properly rubbed down, and we got up the next morning and came to Atlanta, Georgia.
Reverend Abernathy, I appreciate you being our guest here on City TV in Douglasville today. And our viewers have had an opportunity to look at some of the reference material. I wonder, and I realize you're only 9 years old, just a young boy at that time, but could you tell us a little bit about what you remember about that event here in Douglasville, Georgia?
Well, let me just first say that it was almost like my baptismal into the civil rights movement. For me, I had seen my father and Martin Luther King arrested many, many, many times before. I had grown up, and Martin Luther King wouldn't go to jail without my daddy. And many other people, Hosea Williams and many other of the staff had been arrested marching for the freedom of people in America as well as for poor people. And so this was almost my baptismal into the civil rights movement at the young tender age of 9. And I remember the march. I remember the mule train. I remember the spirit of the camaraderie of family. I remember the fun that I had as a child, jumping up on the wagon and holding the reins and rolling down the road with reins in hand of the movement. I remember that. I remember the spirit of family that existed among the civil rights workers. And they looked at me as I was little Ralph. And they certainly, I was a rambunctious boy, all-boy kind of kid, and always playing with the staff and always being very jovial and a bad kid, and just had a lot of fun. And it was just a wonderful opportunity. When we got stopped in Douglasville on our way to Washington, D.C., by way of Douglasville into Atlanta. We were supposed to be going to meet a rally at my father's church, the West 100th Street Baptist Church. And I recall, my sister reminds me now, Donzale, of the fact that when she heard I had been arrested, and she said that she got up a little envious and jealous of the fact that I had been arrested and she didn't get a chance to get arrested. Her being a few years older than me, she was able to remember and recall the fact that they said that I was afraid. And as she mentioned that to me, I could see when I was afraid.
You were 9 years old?
Yeah, I could remember the time that I was a little fearful of that, of the arrest itself. Not really knowing of the unknown, not knowing the unknown of where we're going to go and what's going to happen to us. After we settled in at the National Guard Armory, I remember them taking us to this building, this huge building where we kind of just all settled in at the armory.
The building is still standing today, and it's still used as an armory, by the way.
Wow, isn't
Sure
that special? Mm-hmm. Well, I remember being there, and I remember the fact that the community came out and supported us. There was food available from the citizens of Douglasville. There was a spirit of family and support that came from throughout the community, and that settled my spirit, settled me into my young, energetic 9-year-old rambunctious personality, and the rest of the evening I was all right. I remembered at that time that I knew we were marching for poor people. I knew that we were marching for change in America. The results of that Poor People's Campaign gave us welfare rights, gave us food stamps, gave us a welfare program, gave us a minimum wage, and other things that were needed to help bring up people who have been denied equal opportunity and access, not just African Americans, but poor people in general. And so I understood that what we were doing was powerful, and I had no idea at the time how significant it was, but I grew into its significance. And those are the things that made an impact on my life, and and I understand now why my sister was a little envious of me, because it was true that this was my baptismal.
And it was a historical moment.
Very historical, very historical.
Were you here overnight, just one
Yes,
night?
yeah,
and
we
then-
spent one night, and the next day we we left and finished our journey to West 100th Street Baptist Church. When we arrived at the church, I remember greeting my father, who was so concerned and so worried, along with Hosea Williams and all the other staff members. And I remember saying to him, "Daddy, what are you so upset about?" My mother was there. Everybody was worried. I said, "What is everybody upset about? You do this all the time." And so it was no big deal for me at that moment. But it was a real big deal for them, and it was a real big deal for America, for the work that we were doing to help effect the change that we live and in the quality of life that we live today.
I remember when we talked on the phone a few weeks ago, which, by the way, you called me trying to help someone.
Yes, that's correct.
That's here in Douglasville, and I certainly appreciate that, and I think we've been able to help that lady, and I certainly hope
yes,
she's
you
doing,
have. You absolutely
well.
have. And it's amazing how the Lord works, because when I called you, it was never an intention to talk to you. In fact, it just dawned on me when I was on the phone with the mayor of Douglasville that I would just read that article to you. I was calling to help someone who is a citizen of this city, and you obliged me with the phone call, obliged me with your assistance. And then as we were getting off of the phone, it just dawned on me to call, to read the article to you. And from that, we are here today.
Well, I'm glad you told me that story because when I heard the story, and I remembered after you kind of spiked my memory back 43 years ago, I remember about reading about it in the paper. I didn't live here at that time. And I thought this would be perfect during Black History Month for you to tell those who live here in Douglasville. A lot of them may be like me today that didn't live here at that time, and
Right.
we certainly appreciate you taking your time to do it today.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for your interest in the story. I think that it is a part of the fabric of America, which has helped to make us the great country that we are today. And God bless you, and God bless the
Well,
citizens.
thank
of
you. And it's a
Douglasville.
fabric of our city,
Yes,
the city of Douglasville.
absolutely, which is America.
Right. Well, thank you for joining us today. It certainly was my pleasure. And I know our viewers on City TV and here in Douglasville and Douglas County appreciate you being here also. It was my honor to have you here in Douglasville.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Again, after 43 years.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's an honor to be here with you and to be here with the citizens of this great city, and to have had my story, my baptismal here in a city as great as Douglasville, and be a part of a greater American story. So thank you, and God bless you, and God bless the citizens of Douglasville.
And thank you for joining us today for this very special show.
Oh, this
And
is
you
so
probably
nice.
wonder, what does this mean?
Yeah, that's a tree.
It's a
Isn't
tree,
it?
and there's a story behind the tree. It was a skint chestnut. The city of Douglasville,
Chestnut?
name for Douglasville was skint chestnut at one point in time.
What is skint chestnut?
It's a tree, and the reason it's a skint chestnut, it was just a regular chestnut tree. The Indians took the bark off of the tree as a landmark for their community.
Okay.
And so our founding fathers selected that as a part of the city seal. So this was an Indian territory at one time. And Douglasville was a center of activity, and they wanted to mark their activity, or the area of their activity, with some significance, and so other people could find it. And so they took all the bark
They took
off
all
of the
the
tree.
bark off the tree, and then that would be
The landmark.
The
that
landmark,
folks would seek
right,
out
they
if
would-
they
yeah.
didn't realize
That-
what
okay.
skint chestnut was.
Wow, isn't that special? Okay,
So
well,
would you
thank
have
you.
that?
Thank you, I appreciate
You're
that.
very
I love
welcome.
lapel pins.